There's a moment that comes for all of us, though we rarely see it approaching. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or warning signs. It arrives quietly, like a hairline fracture in glass that you don't notice until the whole pane shatters in your hands. One day you're standing firm, certain of who you are and what you believe, and the next, something inside you begins to fold. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, like a building whose foundation has been secretly eroding for years. And here's what makes it terrifying. You might be the last person to realize it's happening, because the mind, you see, is a masterful deceiver. It will convince you that everything is fine even as the walls cave in around you. It will tell you stories about yourself that feel so real, so vivid, that you'll defend them with your life, never realizing that the very act of defending them is what's tearing you apart from the inside. We live in an age obsessed with strength. Everywhere you look, someone is telling you to be tougher, more resilient, unbreakable. The self-help industrial complex churns out mantras about mindset and willpower as if the human psyche were nothing more than a muscle that needs exercise. But what they don't tell you, what they can't tell you because it would undermine their entire enterprise, is that strength itself can become a prison. That the very strategies we use to hold ourselves together are sometimes the same mechanisms that cause us to fall apart. This is the hidden psychology of crumbling minds, and it operates according to rules that most people never learn to recognize until it's far too late. Think about the last time you felt truly overwhelmed, not just stressed or busy, but genuinely at the edge of your capacity. Maybe it was a relationship that demanded more than you could give. Maybe it was a career that slowly drained the light from your eyes. Maybe it was just the accumulation of 1,000 small disappointments that you kept telling yourself didn't matter. In that moment, what did you do? If you're like most people, you would probably double down. You tried harder. You told yourself to push through, to be stronger, to stop being so sensitive. And here's the cruel irony. That response, that very human instinct to fortify yourself against the pain, is often the beginning of the end. Because there's a difference between resilience and rigidity, and most of us never learned how to tell them apart. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something about human nature that still echoes through the centuries. In his observations of power, politics, and the human condition, he noted that people often destroy themselves not through weakness, but through an inability to adapt. He wrote about leaders who clung to strategies that once brought them victory, even as the world around them changed. They mistook consistency for strength, never realizing that what makes you successful in one season of life can become the very thing that ruins you in the next. The mind operates under the same principle. We develop patterns, ways of thinking and being that serve us well for a time. They become part of our identity. And then imperceptibly, the world shifts. The relationships change. The demands evolve. But we don't. We keep running the same mental programs, using the same emotional strategies, telling ourselves the same stories about who we are and what we need. And slowly, quietly, the mind begins to crumble under the weight of its own inflexibility. Let's talk about what actually happens inside a mind that's beginning to break. It doesn't start with the big, obvious signs, the dramatic breakdown that everyone can see. It starts with something far more subtle. A slight delay in your emotional responses, a numbness where there used to be feeling. You find yourself going through the motions of your life with a strange sense of detachment, as if you're watching yourself from a distance. Conversations that used to energize you now feel exhausting. Activities that once brought joy now feel like obligations. You tell yourself it's just a phase, that you're tired, that things will get better once you get through this particular challenge. But here's what's really happening. Your mind is beginning to protect itself by shutting down. It's like a city under siege, closing its gates one by one, pulling back its defenses, rationing its resources. It feels like wisdom. It feels like you're being strategic, conservative with your energy. But what's actually occurring is the first stage of psychological collapse, and you're interpreting it as strength. The second stage is where things get dangerous, because this is where denial becomes your closest companion. You start to notice that something is off, that the internal machinery isn't running quite right, but instead of investigating the problem, you simply work harder to maintain the facade. You smile when you're supposed to smile. You perform competence at your job. You show up for the people who depend on you. And all the while, there's a voice in the back of your mind, growing louder each day, telling you that you're failing. Not just at specific tasks, but at being human. You look at other people who seem to navigate life with ease, and you wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you just be normal? Why does everything feel so impossibly heavy? And here's the trap. The more you push yourself to perform normalcy, the faster you accelerate your own dissolution. Because a mind under that kind of pressure doesn't heal. It fractures. Machiavelli also taught us about the nature of appearances versus reality, about how the image we project to the world can become a weapon we use against ourselves. He observed that rulers often became prisoners of their own propaganda, forced to live up to the mythic versions of themselves they had created. The same thing happens in the theater of our own minds. We construct an identity, a story about who we are, and then we spend our lives trying to live up to it, even when that identity no longer fits the person we've become. You might have built your sense of self around being capable, around being the person who doesn't break down, who others can rely on, who always finds a way. And that story might have served you beautifully for years. But what happens when you encounter a situation that actually requires you to be vulnerable? What happens when the only path forward is to admit that you can't handle it alone? If your entire identity is wrapped up in being strong, then asking for help feels like annihilation. So you don't ask, you suffer in silence. And the mind, pushed beyond its limits with no relief valve, begins to crack in ways you can't control. The third stage is where things become visceral, undeniable. This is when the body starts to rebel because the mind can no longer contain what it's been holding. You might find yourself lying awake at 3 in the morning, heart pounding for no apparent reason. Or maybe your hands start to shake slightly during routine tasks. Perhaps your stomach turns at the thought of facing another day. These aren't just stress symptoms. They're distress signals from a system that's screaming for attention. Your body is trying to tell you what your mind refuses to acknowledge, that you are not okay, that something fundamental needs to change, that the way you've been living is unsustainable. But even at this stage, many people push through. They take sleeping pills for the insomnia and tacids for the stomach problems. Maybe start drinking a little more to take the edge off. They treat the symptoms while the underlying structure continues to deteriorate, like trying to stop a flood by mopping up water while ignoring the burst pipe in the wall. Now here's where the psychology gets truly interesting, truly dark. Because even as everything falls apart, the mind continues to protect its central narratives. It's phenomenally skilled at rationalization, at creating explanations that preserve your sense of self while reality crumbles around you. You might start to believe that other people are the problem. If your relationships are failing, it's because they don't understand you, because they're too demanding, too sensitive, too needy. If you're struggling at work, it's because your boss is incompetent or your colleagues are undermining you. If you feel disconnected from your own life, it's because the world itself is broken, not because there's something within you that needs attention. This is what psychologists call external attribution. But it's more than just a cognitive bias. It's a survival mechanism. Because if you admitted that the problem might be internal, if you acknowledged that your own patterns and choices and ways of being might be contributing to your suffering, then you'd have to confront something terrifying, the possibility that you've been wrong about yourself all along. Machiavelli wrote extensively about fortune and virtue, about how success requires not just strength, but also the wisdom to recognize when circumstances demand adaptation. He observed that the most dangerous moment for any person or institution is when they're still operating on past victories, still using strategies that once worked brilliantly but have become obsolete. The parallels to mental health are striking. We all carry around psychological strategies that once protected us, patterns we developed in response to earlier challenges or traumas. Maybe you learned early in life that showing weakness led to pain, so you built walls around your emotions. Maybe you discovered that you could earn love through achievement, so you became addicted to productivity. Maybe you found that you could avoid rejection by becoming invisible, by never asking for too much, by always putting others first. These strategies weren't arbitrary. They were brilliant adaptations to the circumstances you faced. They might have saved you, but here's the devastating truth. The defenses that once protected you can become the prison that confines you. The strategies that once made you successful can become the patterns that ensure your failure. And the mind, loyal to its own history, will keep running these programs long after they've stopped serving you, long after they've become actively harmful. Let's examine what happens when someone reaches the point of actual breakdown, when the crumbling becomes catastrophic. It's rarely the dramatic scene you might imagine from movies or television. There's usually no screaming breakdown in a public place, no throwing things or sobbing uncontrollably. More often, it's a quiet surrender. You wake up one morning and you simply can't. Can't go to work, can't return phone calls, can't maintain the pretense any longer. The mask falls away not because you choose to remove it, but because you no longer have the energy to hold it in place. And in that moment, there's often a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief because the exhausting performance is finally over. Terror because now you have to face what you've been running from. The reality of your own fragility, the depth of your own pain, the extent to which you've been lying to yourself about how you're really doing. But here's what's crucial to understand, what almost no one talks about. The breaking point isn't the ending. It's not the moment when everything is lost. It's actually the moment when truth becomes possible. Because only when the false structures collapse can you begin to see what was real underneath all along. Only when the performance ends can you start to discover who you actually are beneath the role you've been playing. This is the paradox at the heart of psychological dissolution. What feels like failure is often the beginning of genuine transformation. What looks like weakness is sometimes the first act of real strength you've performed in years. Because it takes tremendous courage to stop pretending. It takes radical honesty to admit that you're not okay, that you need help, that the way you've been living isn't working. The mind that has the capacity to acknowledge its own brokenness is, in that very acknowledgement, beginning the process of healing. There's a reason why so many wisdom traditions, from Buddhism to Stoicism to various mystical schools, emphasize the necessity of ego death, of letting go of fixed identities. They understood intuitively what modern psychology is now confirming through research, that psychological flexibility, the ability to hold your beliefs and self-concepts lightly, is one of the strongest predictors of mental health and well-being. Machiavelli, pragmatist that he was, would have appreciated this insight. He understood that survival requires adaptation. That power comes not from rigid adherence to principle, but from the intelligence to read changing circumstances and adjust accordingly. Your mind works the same way. The thoughts and beliefs and stories about yourself that you cling to most tightly are often the ones that will hurt you most deeply, not because they're necessarily false, but because any truth held too rigidly becomes a cage. So what do you do with this knowledge? How do you prevent your own mind from crumbling? Or how do you rebuild if the collapse has already begun? The answer isn't in becoming stronger in the conventional sense. It's not about developing more willpower or pushing yourself harder or learning to endure more pain. It's about becoming softer, more flexible, more honest. It's about developing the capacity to notice when your internal narratives are no longer serving you and having the courage to revise them. It's about learning to distinguish between the voice of genuine intuition and the voice of fear disguised as wisdom. It's about recognizing that asking for help isn't weakness, that admitting uncertainty isn't failure, that changing your mind about who you are and what you need isn't betrayal. These are the skills that actually prevent psychological collapse. And they're the exact opposite of what most people have been taught. Consider the practice of self-observation, not in the narcissistic sense of constant self-analysis, but in the mindful sense of noticing your own patterns without judgment. When you find yourself in emotional pain, can you observe it with curiosity rather than immediately trying to fix it or push it away? When you notice yourself telling a familiar story about why your life is the way it is, can you pause and ask whether that story is still true or whether it's just comfortable? When someone offers you feedback that contradicts your self-image, can you sit with the discomfort long enough to consider whether they might be seeing something you can't? This kind of psychological flexibility doesn't mean you become wishy-washy or lose your sense of self. It means you become more real, more grounded in actual moment-to-moment experience, rather than in fixed ideas about who you're supposed to be. The relationship between rigidity and collapse isn't just metaphorical. Neuroscience research shows us that chronic stress and emotional suppression actually change the physical structure of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and emotional regulation, can become impaired. The amygdala, our alarm system for threats, becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, crucial for memory and learning, can actually shrink. In other words, the more you try to power through psychological distress without addressing it, the more you actually damage your brain's capacity to cope with future challenges. You're not building resilience. You're depleting it. You're not becoming stronger. You're becoming more brittle. And brittle things, as anyone who's ever dropped a glass can tell you, don't bend under pressure. They shatter. This is why the hidden psychology of crumbling minds is so insidious. It operates in direct opposition to our cultural narratives about strength and success. We're taught that winners never quit, that failure is an option, that you should fake it till you make it. But your mind doesn't work according to motivational poster logic. Your mind is a complex adaptive system that requires rest, requires authenticity, requires the freedom to not be okay sometimes. When you deny it, these things in service of some abstract ideal of toughness, you're not transcending your limitations. You're guaranteeing your eventual breakdown. And the longer you wait, the more catastrophic that breakdown will be when it finally comes. What would Machiavelli say about all this? Probably something uncomfortable. He'd likely observe that we're all engaged in a kind of political theater with ourselves, trying to maintain power over our own internal kingdoms through force and control. He'd note that this strategy works until it doesn't, and that the wise ruler learns to govern through understanding and adaptation rather than through tyranny. He understood that fear could control people in the short term, but that sustained power required something more nuanced. The same is true for how we govern our own minds. You can rule yourself through fear and shame and relentless self-criticism for a while. You can force yourself to meet impossible standards through sheer will. But eventually, that approach leads to revolution. The suppressed parts of yourself will rise up. The denied needs will make themselves known. The authentic feelings you've been crushing will explode forth in ways you can't control. And when they do, the orderly kingdom you thought you were maintaining will reveal itself to have been a dictatorship on the verge of collapse all along. There's profound freedom in accepting that you're not meant to be invulnerable, that your mind isn't supposed to be an impenetrable fortress, that being human means having limits and weaknesses and areas of genuine fragility. This acceptance doesn't make you weak. It makes you real, and reality, uncomfortable as it often is the only foundation upon which you can build something lasting. All those people you admire for their apparent strength and stability, most of them have learned this lesson the hard way. They've had their own moments of collapse, their own encounters with the limits of their endurance. The difference is that they emerged from those experiences with a different relationship to their own humanity. They stopped treating their vulnerabilities as enemies to be conquered and started treating them as information to be heeded. So right now, wherever you are in your own psychological journey, take a moment to check in with yourself. Not the performing self that you show to the world, but the actual self underneath all the strategies and defenses. How are you really doing? What are you carrying that's too heavy? What story are you telling yourself that might not be true anymore? What would it mean to stop trying so hard to hold it all together and instead allow yourself to fall apart just enough to let the light in through cracks? These aren't easy questions. They might not even have clear answers. But the willingness to ask them, the courage to sit with the uncertainty they provoke, that's where real psychological strength actually lives. The hidden psychology of crumbling minds isn't ultimately about pathology or weakness. It's about the universal human challenge of learning to live authentically in a world that constantly pressures us to be something we're not. It's about recognizing that the mind, for all its incredible capacities, is also a vulnerable organ that requires care and honesty and rest. It's about understanding that the same intelligence that allows you to achieve remarkable things can also be turned against yourself in ways that create profound suffering. And most importantly, it's about knowing that you're not alone in this struggle. Everyone, literally everyone, is navigating the tension between who they're supposed to be and who they actually are. Everyone is working to hold themselves together while also allowing themselves to be real. The people who seem to do it effortlessly are usually just better at hiding the effort. If you found value in this exploration, if something here resonated with your own experience or helped you see your struggles in a new light, then consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that dives deep into the hidden mechanics of being human. Because these conversations matter. Understanding how our minds work, how they break, and how they heal, that's not just abstract psychology. It's a most practical knowledge you can possess. It's the difference between spending your life at war with yourself and learning to live with a kind of hard-won peace. And trust me, that peace is worth fighting for.